The Price of Black Skin, A Tale of Housing Injustice. Chapter titles. Chapter 1. The American Dream Deferred. The dream of home ownership has long been a cornerstone of the American dream, a symbol of stability, security, and generational wealth. For Black families like the Johnsons, however, that dream was never within reach in the same way it was for white families. As James and Evelyn Johnson stood in front of the house they hoped to buy in a quiet suburban neighborhood, they could feel the weight of history pressing against them. Their aspirations were met not with open doors, but with hidden barriers, woven deeply into the fabric of American society. The Johnsons had worked hard their entire lives. James was a war veteran, returning home with the same promises of opportunity that had been made to countless soldiers before him. Evelyn, a school teacher, believed that education and perseverance could carve a path to a better future. But as they attempted to secure a home for their growing family, they quickly realized that the American dream was not designed for them. At every turn, they encountered rejection. The banks denied their mortgage applications not because they lacked financial stability, but because of the red lines drawn on city maps, lines that marked Black neighborhoods as undesirable. Real estate agents refused to show them homes in predominantly white areas, offering instead run-down properties in segregated districts with inflated prices. The FHA, the very institution that was supposed to help families buy homes, actively worked against them, favoring white applicants and ensuring that Black families remained locked out of wealth-building opportunities. As the Johnsons struggled, they met other families facing the same discrimination. They attended community meetings, where activists spoke about the systemic nature of housing injustice. They heard stories of families forced into predatory lending agreements, of homes lost to unjust evictions, of neighborhoods abandoned by city officials who refused to invest in Black communities. The more they learned, the more they realized that their struggle was not unique. It was a pattern, a calculated effort to keep Black families from achieving economic independence. Yet, despite the barriers, the Johnsons refused to give up. They sought legal counsel, connected with civil rights organizations, and protested against the discriminatory practices that sought to keep them in the margins. The American dream had been deferred for too long, but they were determined to fight for their place in it. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn stand outside yet another bank, ready to submit yet another application. Their hands tighten around the paperwork, their faces set with determination. They know the odds are against them, but they also know that if they stop fighting now, their children will face the same struggles in the future. The dream is deferred, but it is not destroyed. At least, not yet. Chapter 2. Bound by Invisible Chains. The barriers to homeownership for Black families were not always explicit. Often they were unseen, embedded within policies, social norms, and financial structures that dictated where and how they could live. James and Evelyn Johnson felt these invisible chains tightening around them with every rejection letter and every insincere smile from bankers and real estate agents who had no intention of helping them. One of the most deceptive and restrictive elements of racial discrimination in housing was not just redlining. It was the unspoken, unwritten rules that kept Black families confined to impoverished neighborhoods. The Johnsons, like so many others, found that even when they earned enough to qualify for a loan, banks classified them as high risk an arbitrary designation meant to exclude them. Real estate agents steered them toward black-only neighborhoods where property values were intentionally kept low through city zoning policies and lack of investment. If they tried to push beyond these boundaries, they met resistance in forms both subtle and overt. James had a colleague at work, a white man named Robert, who applied for a mortgage at the same bank on the same day as James. Robert, despite having a lower income and fewer savings, was approved instantly, while James was asked to provide additional paperwork, endure repeated delays, and was eventually denied. When he confronted the loan officer, he was told, "It's just policy, nothing personal." Meanwhile, Evelyn attended a local housing seminar where she learned that even black families who managed to buy homes faced devaluation. Their homes were appraised for less than similar white-owned homes, and the insurance rates they were offered were significantly higher. This systemic manipulation ensured that even when black families secured housing, their ability to build wealth was severely limited. The Johnsons also faced the harsh reality of restrictive covenants, clauses buried deep within property deeds that prohibited the sale of homes to non-white buyers. While these covenants were technically illegal, their presence still influenced real estate practices. Even when laws changed, the attitudes and structures of exclusion remained firmly in place. The couple refused to accept these restrictions without a fight. They sought legal assistance, learning about class action lawsuits filed by other black families who had been wronged. They met with community leaders who were working to expose discriminatory practices and create pathways for black homeownership. But fighting against invisible chains was exhausting. It meant constantly proving their worth in a system that had already decided they were undeserving. It meant watching white families move into new developments with ease while they were told there were no available homes in those same areas. It meant battling against an unseen force that dictated where they could and could not build their future. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn sit at their kitchen table, surrounded by rejection letters and legal documents, their hands intertwined. The weight of injustice presses upon them, but they refuse to let it break them. They will not let these invisible chains define their future. The fight is far from over. Chapter 3: The Color of Property. James and Evelyn Johnson soon realized that property was not just about land, bricks, and deeds. It was about power. In America, the ability to own property had long been tied to race, with white families granted access to wealth-building opportunities that were systematically denied to black families. The Johnsons, despite their financial stability and determination, found themselves battling forces that had been shaping the housing landscape for generations. Every house they considered came with an unspoken condition: their presence in a neighborhood would be unwelcome. White homeowners, fearful that black families would lower property values, resisted integration through silent agreements and hostile actions. Some real estate agents outright refused to sell to them, while others subtly directed them toward less desirable areas, warning that they would be more comfortable there. The Johnsons learned about blockbusting, a predatory tactic used by real estate speculators. Agents would spread rumors that black families were moving into a white neighborhood, causing panic among white homeowners. These homeowners, fearing a decline in property value, would sell quickly, often at reduced prices. The speculators would then flip the homes at inflated rates to black buyers who had few other options. This practice artificially manipulated markets. forcing black families to pay more for less desirable homes while accelerating white flight. Even when they considered buying in a predominantly black neighborhood, the Johnsons saw how the system worked against them. These neighborhoods were deliberately deprived of investment, schools were underfunded, infrastructure was neglected, and businesses were hesitant to open in areas labeled as risky by banks and insurers. When black families did manage to purchase homes, their property values were deliberately undervalued, limiting their ability to accumulate wealth and pass it down to future generations. The realization that property was inherently racialized was crushing. James and Evelyn had always believed that hard work and financial responsibility would lead to success. But as they examined the forces working against them, they saw the truth. The color of their skin dictated the value of their property, their mortgage terms, and their ability to build a future. As the chapter closes, the Johnsons stand outside yet another home they were denied access to, watching as a white couple signs the papers with ease. The disparity was blatant and the injustice undeniable. But rather than accept defeat, James and Evelyn made a decision. They would fight not just for a home, but for the right to claim their place in a system that had excluded them for far too long. Chapter 4. When the Banks Say No. James and Evelyn Johnson had spent months meticulously preparing their finances, gathering every necessary document and researching loan options in hopes of securing a mortgage. But no amount of preparation could shield them from the harsh reality of systemic discrimination embedded in the banking system. Every time they applied for a loan, the answer was the same: no. The reasons varied. Sometimes they were told their credit history wasn't strong enough, even though they had never missed a payment on their bills. Other times, they were informed that the neighborhoods they were considering were deemed high risk, making them ineligible for loans. The irony was that these so-called high-risk areas were designated as such by the very banks that refused to invest in them, ensuring their continued decline. The rejection was not only financial but deeply personal. At one bank, James sat across from a loan officer who smiled apologetically as he slid the denial letter across the desk. "It's just company policy," he said, avoiding eye contact. James knew better. It was not policy, it was a deliberate attempt to exclude black families from home ownership. Evelyn tried applying under her own name, hoping that a different approach might yield better results. But when she visited another lender, she encountered the same dismissive attitude. "Your financials look fine, but unfortunately, we're not issuing loans for that part of town," the banker said. It didn't matter that the Johnsons had steady jobs, a strong savings account, or a responsible financial record. The unspoken rule was clear: black families were not welcome to build wealth through home ownership. Frustration turned to anger when James discovered that a white colleague at work, with a lower income and weaker credit score, had been approved for a mortgage at the same bank that denied him. The bias was glaring, yet proving it was nearly impossible. The banks hid behind carefully worded policies and vague justifications, ensuring they could never be held accountable. Determined to push back, the Johnsons reached out to advocacy groups that had been fighting racial discrimination in lending for years. They learned that they were not alone. Countless black families had faced the same denials, often forced into predatory lending schemes or overpriced contract sales that left them vulnerable to eviction. Together with other victims of lending discrimination, they began to document their experiences, preparing to take legal action. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn sit at their dining table, surrounded by rejection letters. But this time, there is no despair in their eyes, only determination. They refuse to accept no as the final answer. If the banks won't grant them a mortgage, they will find another way to fight for the home and the future they deserve. Chapter 5. A Key That Doesn't Fit. James and Evelyn Johnson finally managed to secure a mortgage, a feat that had felt impossible given the systemic barriers they had faced. Holding the keys to their new home, they thought they had overcome the worst. But as they approached the house they had fought so hard for, they realized that the struggles of Black home ownership did not end at the doorstep. The key was in their hands, but the doors to true security and acceptance remained locked. From the moment they moved in, their presence was met with hostility. Their new neighbors, all white, watched from their porches with wary eyes. Some avoided them entirely, while others offered forced cold greetings. A few were more blatant in their disapproval. One morning they found garbage dumped across their front yard. Another time their son overheard a neighbor telling her child not to play with those people. The message was clear: they were not welcome. Financial pressures also mounted quickly. Though they had secured a loan, their interest rates were noticeably higher than those of their white counterparts. Evelyn discovered that their home had been appraised for far less than similar homes in the same neighborhood, making it difficult to build equity. Insurance companies charged them higher premiums, citing market risk as justification. These factors made it increasingly difficult to keep up with their mortgage, despite their steady incomes. Repairs and maintenance became another unexpected battle. Contractors either refused to work in their home or charged inflated prices. When their heating system broke in the middle of winter, they waited weeks for a repairman who had promised to come as soon as he could. Meanwhile, their white neighbors received immediate service for minor issues. James and Evelyn realized that they had been sold an illusion. Home ownership was supposed to be a pathway to stability and generational wealth, yet the system ensured that Black families like theirs remained in a precarious position. It wasn't just about owning a home. It was about being systematically denied the benefits that came with it. The chapter ends with James sitting at the kitchen table late at night, flipping through unpaid bills, his frustration mounting. He clenches the house keys in his fist, feeling the weight of everything they had fought for. Across from him, Evelyn looks through legal documents, determined to find a way to challenge the discriminatory practices stacked against them. They had earned this home, but they were not going to accept a life where the key never truly fit. Their fight was far from over. Chapter 6. Red Lines, Black Lives. The term redlining had been unfamiliar to James and Evelyn Johnson when they first began their search for a home, but they quickly learned how deeply it shaped their reality. The red lines drawn on city maps decades ago dictated everything about their lives: where they could live, how much they would pay for housing, and whether their children would have access to quality schools. These red lines, created by banks and federal agencies, marked Black neighborhoods as hazardous, ensuring that investment, development, and even basic city services bypassed these communities. James studied an old city map at a local community meeting, tracing the thick red lines that sectioned off entire Black neighborhoods from financial opportunities. He realized that no matter how much money he earned, those boundaries would always block his family from securing the same benefits as white homeowners. The homes in these districts were undervalued, Banks refused to grant loans for renovations, and landlords exploited tenants with high rents and little upkeep. Evelyn spoke with elders in the neighborhood who had lived under redlining their entire lives. They shared stories of being denied mortgages despite their stable incomes. Some had tried to buy homes in white areas, only to be met with threats or mysteriously revoked sales agreements. Others had been trapped in predatory rent-to-own contracts, never able to fully claim ownership. One elderly man, Mr. Lewis, recalled how his father had saved for years to buy a home, only to be forced into an exploitative contract that left his family homeless when a single payment was missed. The Johnsons saw firsthand how redlining affected more than just homeownership. It shaped the entire infrastructure of their community. Schools in redlined areas received less funding, businesses struggled to secure loans, and public services like trash collection and street repairs were consistently delayed. When emergencies struck, response times from police and fire departments were slower compared to white neighborhoods. Every aspect of daily life was influenced by lines drawn decades ago, but still enforced by modern policies and practices. Determined to push back, James and Evelyn joined local activists who were fighting to expose redlining and its lasting consequences. They helped collect data documenting stories of unfair loan denials and property devaluation. They attended city council meetings, demanding investment in their community. Through their efforts, they realized that redlining was not just a historical policy, it was an ongoing practice disguised as market risk assessments and lending policies. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn stand outside a bank with a group of community members, holding folders filled with evidence of discrimination. They are no longer just victims of redlining, they are ready to fight against it. The red lines had shaped their lives, but they refused to let them define their future. Chapter 7: Contracts of Deception. James and Evelyn Johnson thought they had finally crossed the threshold into homeownership, but they quickly learned that the contract they signed was not the lifeline they had hoped for. It was a trap. Predatory lending practices had been refined over generations, designed to extract wealth from black families rather than help them build it. The Johnsons' agreement, filled with complex legal jargon and hidden clauses, was one such deceptive contract. When they reviewed the terms of their mortgage, they realized the payments seemed to increase unexpectedly. When they questioned the lender, they were met with vague explanations about market adjustments and variable interest rates. What they had signed was not a fair mortgage, but a predatory contract with balloon payments, terms that ensured they would be paying far more than the home was worth without building real equity. Their home was never truly theirs. It remained under the bank's control, and missing a single payment could result in immediate foreclosure. They were not alone. Other black families in their community had been lured into similar contracts, often through contract buying schemes, an exploitative practice where buyers made monthly payments but had no legal ownership of their homes until the final payment was made. If they missed a single payment, they lost everything, with no recourse. Unlike traditional mortgages, these contracts offered no protection against sudden eviction. Families who had spent years making payments were thrown out with no equity, no savings, and nowhere to go. James and Evelyn sought legal help, only to find that the law was not on their side. These contracts, though unethical, were not illegal. The system had been structured to allow lenders to exploit black families with little consequence. The FHA and banking institutions had actively encouraged these practices, ensuring that even as Black families bought homes, they never truly gained the financial security that came with home ownership. Determined not to be another statistic, James and Evelyn joined a growing movement of Black homeowners challenging these contracts. They worked with community leaders, gathered evidence, and attended public hearings where they shared their experiences. The fight would not be easy, but they refused to let their home be taken from them without resistance. As the chapter closes, James stands in their small living room, gripping the contract papers in his hands, while Evelyn writes a letter to their attorney. They know the battle ahead will be grueling, but they also know they are fighting for more than just their own home. They are fighting to expose an entire system built on deception and designed to strip Black families of their rightful place in the American dream. Chapter 8: The Walls of Segregation. James and Evelyn Johnson had come to understand that segregation was not just about separate schools or designated neighborhoods. It was a system carefully maintained through legal policies, financial control, and social pressure. The walls that separated Black and white communities were not made of bricks and mortar. They were built from decades of exclusionary practices that continued to shape their daily lives. Even as they fought for their right to own a home, they saw how segregation dictated every aspect of their existence. Public services in their neighborhood were systematically neglected. Their roads were cracked, their schools were underfunded, and garbage pickup came irregularly. While just across town, white neighborhoods flourished, with well-maintained parks, newly paved streets, and thriving businesses. The Johnsons also learned how zoning laws reinforced segregation. When Black families attempted to move into white areas, city officials rezoned the land, turning residential plots into industrial zones, ensuring that Black homeowners lived near factories, waste dumps, or busy highways. These policies directly impacted property values, keeping Black communities in a cycle of economic disadvantage. The real estate industry played its role as well. Even though the federal government had outlawed explicit segregation in housing, realtors continued to use racial steering, a practice of guiding Black buyers toward Black neighborhoods and white buyers toward white ones. The unspoken rule remained: integration was to be avoided. James and Evelyn felt this firsthand when they attempted to purchase a home outside of their designated district. The house was available, and they met all the financial qualifications, but the seller suddenly took it off the market when he realized they were Black. When they pressed for answers, they were given an excuse about unforeseen circumstances, but later learned that the white neighbors had pressured the seller into withdrawing the offer. Frustration turned into action. The Johnsons joined local protests demanding fair housing enforcement. They connected with journalists willing to expose the discriminatory practices that banks, real estate agents, and city officials used to maintain segregation. They realized that while the walls of segregation were invisible to some, they were painfully real to those trapped behind them. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn stand before a city council meeting, prepared to speak out against the policies that kept Black families confined to underfunded communities. They know that the walls of segregation will not fall easily, but they are determined to lay the first cracks in the foundation. Chapter 9: The Cost of Belonging. James and Evelyn Johnson had fought tirelessly to secure their home, believing that once they crossed the threshold, their battle would be over. But what they quickly realized was that belonging came at a price that Black families like theirs were forced to pay every single day. From the moment they moved in, they faced a constant undercurrent of hostility. Their white neighbors, who had once greeted them with forced smiles, now barely acknowledged them. Some engaged in more overt acts of resistance. Trash mysteriously appeared on their lawn, their mailbox was frequently knocked over, and once they found a dead rat on their doorstep. The message was clear: they were not wanted. The Johnsons' children bore the weight of this unspoken war too. At school, their son David was bullied by classmates who had heard their parents whispering about how those people were changing the neighborhood. Their daughter Sophia was excluded from playdates, and when Evelyn confronted the other mothers, she was met with thinly veiled excuses about different upbringings and cultural differences. Meanwhile, financial burdens grew heavier. Their property taxes skyrocketed as local officials subtly adjusted zoning laws, disproportionately affecting black homeowners. The city raised fees on utilities, targeting their neighborhood under the guise of community improvements that never materialized. They watched as their white neighbors received home improvement loans with ease, while their own applications were repeatedly denied. Without the ability to renovate, their home's value stagnated, reinforcing the cycle of economic suppression. The emotional toll became just as heavy as the financial one. James felt the weight of every rejection, every discriminatory policy, every act of aggression. Evelyn, once hopeful about their fresh start, struggled with the feeling of isolation, trapped in a community that refused to see them as equals. They had bought a house, but had they truly found a home? Despite everything, they refused to back down. They found solace in a growing network of black homeowners facing the same injustices. Together, they formed a neighborhood coalition, fighting back against predatory practices and advocating for fair treatment. They attended city meetings, filed complaints, and began pushing back against the policies that sought to push them out. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn sit on their front porch, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that had yet to fully embrace them. The price of belonging had been steep, but they knew the cost of giving up would be even greater. The fight for their home and their dignity was far from over. Chapter 10. A Fight Beyond Mortgages. James and Evelyn Johnson had come to realize that their battle for homeownership extended far beyond securing a mortgage. Owning a home was just the beginning. Keeping it, maintaining it, and ensuring that it remained a source of stability was an ongoing struggle, one that required constant vigilance against the forces working to strip black families of their hard-earned property. Even after making timely payments, they faced challenges that white homeowners never had to consider. The city began rezoning their neighborhood, a move that disproportionately affected black homeowners by raising property taxes and attracting industrial developments that lowered residential appeal. The Johnsons were forced to fight not just against financial institutions, but against policies that sought to destabilize their community. Insurance companies too played a role in this silent war. When the Johnsons sought home insurance, they were quoted rates significantly higher than those of their white neighbors. When their home sustained minor damages from a storm, their insurance company delayed payments, questioning whether their property was worth the investment. Many other black homeowners faced similar struggles, with claims being denied or undervalued, making it nearly impossible to afford essential repairs. Beyond financial and legal hurdles, the Johnsons also had to contend with organized efforts to push black families out. predatory buyers, disguised as helpful investors, frequently sent letters offering to buy their home for far less than market value. White homeowners had already begun to sell their properties and move, further isolating the Johnsons and other black families who had fought to integrate the neighborhood. The couple joined a coalition of black homeowners determined to fight these tactics. They attended legal workshops, filed complaints against unfair insurance practices, and worked with activists to push back against discriminatory zoning laws. Through these efforts, they found solidarity in their struggle, understanding that their fight was not just about keeping their home, but about securing the future of their entire community. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn sit in a crowded community center, listening to stories from other black homeowners who are experiencing the same challenges. They realize that their battle is not just personal, it is part of a larger movement. The fight beyond mortgages is a fight for justice, and they are prepared to see it through. Chapter 11. Evicted by Design. James and Evelyn Johnson had fought relentlessly to secure and maintain their home, but the system was not designed to let them keep it. At every turn, obstacles were placed in their way: rising property taxes, discriminatory lending policies, and predatory real estate practices, all pushing them toward an outcome that had been predetermined long before they ever signed their mortgage agreement. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a foreclosure notice. Confused, James and Evelyn carefully reviewed their mortgage payments, knowing they had never missed one. But buried deep within their contract was a clause allowing the bank to adjust interest rates at will, making their payments suddenly unaffordable. When they called to dispute it, they were met with cold indifference. "There's nothing we can do," the loan officer said. "Your home is at risk of default." As they scrambled for solutions, another crisis loomed. The city, under the guise of urban renewal, announced plans to seize homes in their neighborhood for redevelopment. Black homeowners who had worked tirelessly to build their communities were being displaced under eminent domain laws that disproportionately targeted black neighborhoods. The Johnsons received a notice that their home was in a designated redevelopment zone, a bureaucratic way of saying they were being forced out. Panic set in as they realized their options were few. White families facing similar circumstances often had resources or social connections to fight back, but the Johnsons were met with legal loopholes designed to strip them of any power. Attorneys who might have taken their case were too expensive, and local government officials turned a blind eye to their pleas for justice. The neighborhood they had fought to integrate was now being dismantled piece by piece. Their black neighbors faced similar fates, some receiving lowball offers for their homes, others threatened with eviction over technicalities in their contracts. The land, they realized, was valuable, but only once it was stripped from the black families who had lived there for decades. Determined not to go down without a fight, James and Evelyn joined forces with other affected homeowners. They organized protests, held press conferences, and demanded accountability. Their battle reached the media, shedding light on the discriminatory policies that had long been hidden behind legal jargon and corporate decisions. But the odds were stacked against them. Laws were written to protect financial institutions, not the people whose lives were being uprooted. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn stand in their nearly empty home, surrounded by packed boxes. Their children, confused and heartbroken, ask where they will go next. James clenches his fists, vowing that while they may be evicted from their home, they will never be evicted from the fight for justice. Their struggle is not over. It has only just begun. Chapter 12. The Courtroom Reckoning. James and Evelyn Johnson had exhausted every possible avenue to keep their home. They had fought against discriminatory lending, unfair tax hikes, predatory buyers, and the silent yet crushing force of systemic racism. Now their battle had led them to a place they had never imagined: the courtroom. Their home, their dignity, and their future rested in the hands of a judge who, like the institutions they had battled, may or may not recognize their struggle as injustice. The courtroom was filled with tension. On one side sat James and Evelyn, accompanied by civil rights attorneys who had taken their case pro bono, recognizing its significance in the broader fight against housing discrimination. On the other side sat representatives from the bank, the city, and real estate investors, all determined to see the case dismissed. They had power, money, and influence on their side. The Johnsons had truth, but was that enough? The trial began with their lawyers laying out the evidence. Documents that detailed the predatory terms of their mortgage, proof of the city's targeted rezoning efforts, and case studies demonstrating that Black families were disproportionately affected by foreclosure policies. They presented testimonies from neighbors who had faced similar struggles, as well as economic reports proving that redlining was still actively shaping Black communities decades after it had been declared illegal. But the defense was relentless. The bank argued that the Johnsons had simply failed to meet their financial obligations, claiming their situation was not about race but about economic realities. The city representatives insisted that the rezoning was done in the interest of urban renewal and not to displace Black homeowners. The real estate developers feigned innocence, stating they were just following the market. The courtroom became a battleground of statistics versus lived experiences, of institutional power versus the voices of the oppressed. As James took the stand, he spoke not just for himself, but for every Black homeowner who had ever been pushed out, tricked, and denied the right to build wealth. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he described the years of struggle, the endless nights of fear, and the feeling of being seen as an outsider in a country he had fought for as a veteran. Evelyn followed, her words carrying the weight of every mother forced to explain to her children why they had to leave their home. The judge listened, his face unreadable. The final verdict was days away, but the Johnsons knew that, regardless of the outcome, their fight would not end here. Their case had drawn attention, inspiring other families to come forward with their own stories. Whether they won or lost, they had already ignited a movement. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn walk out of the courtroom, hand in hand, looking up at the towering courthouse. They had fought for their home, but more importantly, they had fought for justice. Whatever the ruling, they knew one thing for certain: their voices would not be silenced. Chapter 13. Building on Broken Foundations. James and Evelyn Johnson had fought against a system designed to exclude them, and while their legal battle had drawn national attention, it had not yet guaranteed them justice. Their fight was part of a much larger struggle, one that had left countless Black families displaced, financially ruined, and trapped in a cycle of generational disadvantage. Now, as they stood on the fractured remains of their efforts, they had to decide what came next. The verdict in their case had been bittersweet. While the court acknowledged the racial discrimination embedded in housing practices, the ruling provided no immediate relief. The bank was fined but faced no real consequences. The city pledged reforms but took no action to reverse the harm done. The Johnsons would not be returning to their home, but the fight was not over. Their legal battle had exposed the injustices of the housing system to the public. Community activists, policymakers, and journalists had rallied behind their cause. Their story was no longer just about them. It had become a catalyst for change. James and Evelyn redirected their anger and grief into advocacy. They worked alongside housing justice organizations, fighting for stronger fair housing laws and protections against predatory lending. They spoke at town halls, testified before legislative committees, and mentored other Black families navigating the same obstacles they once faced. Meanwhile, they sought to rebuild their own lives. Finding another home proved just as difficult as before, but this time they had the knowledge, resources, and support of a movement behind them. They refused to accept another predatory contract or settle in an underfunded neighborhood. They were determined to secure a home where their children could thrive without the constant threat of displacement. The emotional toll of their journey remained heavy. At times, they questioned whether the fight was worth it. The pain of losing their home lingered, and the wounds of systemic racism did not heal easily. But each time they met another family struggling against the same forces, they were reminded of why they could not afford to stop. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn stand before a crowd of protesters outside City Hall, their hands intertwined. They are not just fighting for a house. They are fighting to dismantle the broken foundations upon which racial inequality in housing was built. Their battle had cost them dearly, but it had also given them something invaluable: the power to push for a future where no family would have to endure what they had. Chapter 14: The House That Justice Built. After years of struggle, displacement, and advocacy, James and Evelyn Johnson had finally arrived at a moment that once seemed impossible. They stood before their new home, not just any house, but one they had secured through resilience, legal battles, and the collective power of a movement that refused to accept injustice. This home was more than just shelter. It was a symbol of what could be achieved when communities fought together against systemic racism. The Johnsons had spent years being told they didn't belong, that they would never have a place in neighborhoods designed to keep them out. But here they stood, proof that justice, while delayed, was not denied. The journey to this moment had not been easy. After losing their first home to foreclosure and city redevelopment schemes, they had faced financial uncertainty and homelessness. But through their activism, they had gained allies, civil rights attorneys, journalists, and fellow homeowners who had also suffered at the hands of predatory lending and redlining. Their case had inspired new policies aimed at protecting Black homebuyers from the same traps that had nearly cost them everything. With the help of a community-led housing initiative, the Johnsons secured a fair mortgage, one with transparent terms and reasonable rates. It was a stark contrast to their previous experience, where every document had been laced with deception. This time, they had legal protections ensuring they would not be evicted by design, nor would they fall victim to the same cycle that had claimed the homes of so many before them. As they walked through the house, their children ran ahead, exploring the rooms, laughing in a way they hadn't in years. This house represented stability, a future they could finally build on. The backyard would be a place for birthdays and barbecues, the front porch, a space to watch the sunset without fear of neighbors' stares. It was not just a home for their family, it was a victory for everyone who had fought alongside them. But even as they settled in, James and Evelyn knew their work was not done. Housing discrimination had not been eradicated. Predatory lending still targeted Black families. Cities continued to displace communities under the guise of development. The Johnsons had secured their home, but they had also become leaders in a movement determined to break the cycle for good. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn hang a framed newspaper clipping on the wall, an article about their case titled "The Fight for Fair Housing, a Victory Against Redlining." They glance at one another, knowing that their story is far from over. Their home was not just a personal triumph, it was the house that justice built, and they would ensure that many more like it would follow. Chapter 15: Breaking the Cycle. James and Evelyn Johnson had fought a battle that spanned generations. Their journey to home ownership had not just been about securing a house, it had been about dismantling the systemic racism that had kept Black families from building generational wealth. But even after winning their personal fight, they knew the work was far from over. The cycle of housing discrimination, predatory lending, and displacement would continue unless it was confronted head-on. Determined to ensure that no family would endure the same struggle they had faced, the Johnsons turned their victory into action. They partnered with civil rights groups, legal organizations, and community activists to advocate for fair housing policies. James worked with financial literacy programs to help Black families navigate the mortgage system, exposing the hidden traps that lenders used to exploit them. Evelyn joined city planning boards, pushing for reforms to prevent redlining, unfair zoning laws, and gentrification efforts that disproportionately harmed Black communities. Their advocacy extended beyond their immediate neighborhood. They traveled across the country, speaking at universities, town halls, and legal forums, sharing their story and raising awareness about modern-day housing discrimination. Their experience became a case study in fair housing movements, influencing legislation designed to hold banks and developers accountable for discriminatory practices. Despite these strides, obstacles remained. Developers still sought to push Black families out of urban centers under the guise of progress. Government policies continued to favor large corporations over community-led housing initiatives. But James and Evelyn refused to let cynicism take root. They had seen what collective action could achieve, and they believed in the power of persistence. Years later, their children, now grown, carried forward their legacy. David became a lawyer specializing in civil rights law, representing families facing housing discrimination. Sophia became a community organizer, fighting for equitable housing policies. The home that James and Evelyn had fought so hard for became a gathering place for activists, a hub of resistance and hope. As the chapter closes, James and Evelyn sit on their porch, watching as a new Black family moves into the neighborhood. A family that did not have to fight the same battles they once did. The cycle had not been fully broken, but the cracks were widening, and with every voice raised in protest, every law challenged, and every family that secured a home without fear, the foundation of injustice crumbled a little more. They had not just secured a house, they had helped change a system. The fight was not over, but they had ensured that future generations would no longer have to fight alone.